I want to welcome Jack Moore and Julia Ziegler joining me on Zoom. And it was Julie's idea to turn the coverage of this trial into a podcast. It was Jack who really made it come together. And it's been 7 years since the trial began, and we started this project that ended up being 22 hours. At the time, we were all working at WTOP in DC, myself as a reporter, Jack as a digital editor, and Julie as a digital news director. Guys, thanks for doing this. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. The gang's all together again.
Okay, so Jay-Z, let's start with a little quick personal update because this is the first time everybody's hearing from us.
Sure.
Where are you now in life? What's new?
Yeah. I'm still in DC. I'm still at WTOP, as everyone can see. And I am now the director of news and programming at WTOP. So that means I oversee the newsroom here.
Big cheese, the big cheese.
That should be what's on my business card. I like that better.
What about you, Jack?
So I'm in New York now and still kind of in the news and writing space and kind of having some new adventures.
Awesome. Okay, so obviously we're going to start at the beginning with how the podcast got started. Julie, can you set the stage? Because we knew it was going to be a big trial, but what made you think this could be a podcast?
You know, at that time, it was so very different, right? I remember you guys walking, well, you specifically, Megan, walking into my office every day at the end of, whatever was going on in the trial that day. And you saying, you and Jack coming to me and saying, oh my gosh, we have so much. What are we putting in our on air pieces? What are we going to put in the web article? And I think I very off the cuff, very flip, said something like, you know what? Why don't you guys just record everything you're talking about? Because you guys were doing these calls every day, you in the courtroom and Jack back in the office. And I remember saying something to you guys like, you know what? Why don't you just record your calls? Maybe we'll do a podcast or something. And it was almost kind of a funny comment. Like we had never done a podcast. We didn't know what the heck it meant to build a podcast, write a podcast,
Right.
produce a podcast. But we were like, I don't know. We don't know what that means, but maybe we'll do a podcast. And so you guys just started recording your calls. And what I remember is we had always said, once we get to the end of the trial, we will determine, kind of what we have, what was recorded, and if we thought that this would make a good podcast. And I also remember at the time that it was very important to both of you that if we were to do a podcast, that it was not going to be something that was sensational. We didn't want to
Yeah.
do a true crime podcast and sensationalize someone's trauma, a family's trauma, right? Family's trauma.
Mhm.
And and so I know that when we got to the point of determining that we were going to do a podcast, that was something that was at the top of all of our minds. Like, if we're going to tell this story, we need to have a reason behind doing it. And ultimately, we decided that we thought that there was a reason to tell this story.
Jack, I feel like it was we pushed back a little bit.
Well, if we
Like
could, if
you
I could
guys,
take a step back for a second, because when, I'm thinking about the daily court process and you being in the courtroom and then calling back to the newsroom and the purpose for that on a day-to-day level was so that we could do this live blog for the website, which had kind of short form articles, tracking all of the developments in court. And
which you see by the way all the time now, like in the Diddy trial and all these different huge trials that have
yeah,
happened.
yeah, and they
But that was
you
sort of
can't
new at
have
that time. Yeah.
you can't have a laptop and be typing away in the courtroom or whatever. So I think that even though we were recording the calls, we weren't really quite, like performing for the cameras. Like the reason for the call was so that you could give me the information to update the articles. And so I think that over time, and I was just looking back at the transcripts that we made of those calls, and we didn't get the first week because we didn't really know what we were doing and we
Yeah.
hadn't really planned on it yet. So like the calls start with the second week, and they're very kind of unvarnished because we're just, and it's like, wait, what? What does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. Or how does that fit? Or, we're kind of saying I know when we went back to put them in some of the episodes, we had to be careful a little bit about what we wanted to share because there was sometimes we were speculating about the case and things that we wouldn't necessarily want, that's not really backed up by anything other than our own supposition or whatever. So we don't
Right.
want to report it. But, just, besides us as journalists, just us as people trying to figure out this case, so yeah, it turned into a really good gold mine of information about how we were processing the case as it was happening.
That leads me
And
to another thing that was a challenge for me was you were saying, sharing the natural reaction, sharing who we are as people. And in journalism, that is sort of frowned upon ethically. Obviously, you don't want to sway somebody's understanding or perception of a story, and there's frankly not time for it. And you want to hear from an expert who knows what they're talking about, not just a lay person who's like, wow, that was crazy. Um, so but in podcast world, especially for hosts, oftentimes you hear that more is people's reaction and their own personal supposition, as you were saying. And I think the hardest part for me was taking those calls and, like you said, I didn't know that was going to be on a podcast. And then taking my natural reactions and sharing them and deciding what to share because we didn't, again, even with our listeners, we didn't want them to think, oh, well, Megan thinks this is going to go this way, so that's probably how it's going to go, and I could be totally wrong.
yeah, I mean, I think maybe one of the benefits was that some time had passed, like in the actual thick of it, maybe there's a little different calculus than like several months later, because by that point the trial was already over. But I do think, it was kind of like so many times throughout this process we just came to a point where had to choose the least worst option for something. And so to try to bring this trial to life, there was no cameras in the courtroom. So I mean the best thing would have been to have audio of the trial itself that we could play. And since we didn't have that, okay, how can we bring this to life? And we had these basically audio diaries. So, and kind of our genuine reactions and our, puzzlement about certain things helped helped illustrate that in a way that probably, in that old concept of radio as a theater of the mind, probably um probably brought it to life in a completely different way. I can remember my grandma, she always listened to the radio and she loved listening to baseball games on the radio. And she preferred listening to it to watching it. She
Yeah.
didn't, for her, it was more real, she grew up listening to baseball games on the radio. So for her, it was much more, it was a bigger picture in her head than anything she could see on TV. So I think that's, the same way that out of our limitation, we were able to make it come to life, perhaps in a way that was even bigger than, true reality.
Hmm. Well, it was a 6 week trial. We were there for every single day of it, um, which is rare. I can't tell you
Yeah.
how rare that is in covering trials for a non-national outlet. I mean, if you don't, we have limited staff, and if it's not like a Trump trial, like a trial of the year, especially even for a national outlet, just putting somebody in that courtroom every single day is really a commitment. And usually you go for openings, you go for closings, and then like the days that you know there's going to be somebody really big testifying. Jack, can you explain sort of how what the rhythm was of the day? And I can obviously chime in, but you said, I was in the courtroom all day, so I would kind of come out and call you and start talking a million miles an hour.
Yeah, well, and you would know this because usually, like, when you go into court in the morning, if the prosecution is doing their case first, they indicate to the judge, who they're going to call that morning. So you would get a heads up, like, oh, we know this person's going to call. We knew like when this stepmother was going to come, and so you get a bit of a heads up. And I think maybe you might have texted me a few times. I mean, especially when Darren took the stand,
Mm.
that was like, crazy. But and then, for the, long periods of time, several hours while the testimony is going on, I'm just waiting by the phone.
Right.
Then, then you race out and you always took pictures of your notes and then just send it to me. So I could begin to read it. I could get most of it because you have very clear handwriting, and
Well,
very
thank
good
you.
note taker. Very good note taker. I remember the one week that I was filling in, I was like, God, this is hard, to make it make sense, not just for, yourself.
Right.
And
Right.
then, then you call to kind of fill in the gaps between the notes, and then we're just, then you try to turn that into what's the lead? What's the,
Hmm.
what's the takeaway? What's the headline? And a lot of this times with the trial, and talking about storytelling, that trials are all about stories. The prosecution is telling a story, the defense is telling a story. But the way, just because of logistics, the way that things happen, like it's out of order, or it's not strictly chronological in the presentation of evidence and witnesses, and so that you really, we were a lot of the times in those calls puzzling out, where does this fit?
Right.
But so and so said before that at this time, and so that the whole idea with the podcast was to kind of untangle that and put it into kind of a more logical order.
Well said. Yeah. And we would get a break for lunch. I think we get like a, gosh, I want to say it was an hour, but maybe yeah, it was probably an hour. So I'd run outside because you cannot record anything within DC Superior Court. So I would have written my WTOP scripts because I obviously have to, I'm working. So I have to file for what happened that day, and I would file twice a day. So I'd go out, record what I was going to do for WTOP, send it in, send in my lead, then take my pictures of my notes, send those to Jack, call Jack, start going through, okay, so this person's name was spelled this, and I don't really know how this fits, and we'd have our little conversations. And then I'd like go stuff a sandwich down my throat and run back upstairs because it was like everybody else had been there for 5 minutes, kind of waiting for the courtroom to open, and I was always coming in hot. Barely made it back.
Like always, Megs.
I
Like
know,
always.
I know, but I made it. I made it. And it was interesting too because all the reporters sat next to each other, and you think of media outlets as being in competition with each other, but just as a quick aside, I mean, every outlet, not every single day, but most of them had somebody there every single day. And sometimes if a lawyer is saying, "Oh yeah, their name is spelled Moor," and they'll turn their head or something, you're like, "Wait, how is it spelled? What?"
Yeah, did I
And
get that? Yeah.
right, and you would have to kind of turn to the other person and see. So it really became, it felt like almost like a classroom atmosphere where you're like, "Wait, what did the teacher say? What I missed that." So that was kind of fun too, having that camaraderie
Yeah.
in a
Yeah,
courtroom.
I was just looking at the transcripts again of the court calls, and when on the day that Darren went ended up testifying, which was a surprise, a shock to everybody, because it's just a kind of a rule of thumb. I mean, almost every defense attorney will say, don't take the stand.
Yeah.
But they announced it, in the morning. The defense said, because the judge was like, "Oh, how many witnesses do you have?" And the defense said, like, "Oh, we're going to finish up with so and so, and then we're going to call Darren Wint." And in the call, what you relate to me is like all of a sudden there was like this hubbub in the courtroom, and Paul Wagner, who was then at Fox 5,
Right.
and now he's at NBC Washington, but he was in the courtroom covering for Fox 5. And when they said that, and there was this kind of like murmur, and he leaned back to you and he said, "Did I hear that right?"
And Paul, of course, went on to be the host of the next two seasons of American Nightmare. So he's very well known to the listeners. But yeah, he was, yes, we all just helped each other out. Quickly going back to sort of how the sausage is made here, we had never done a podcast before. So we had no idea, number one, that it would end up consuming our lives and that we would be thinking about it constantly. Because one of the nice things about reporting is you have something new every day.
Yeah.
So for me, it was unusual to have a project that spanned, like that was like something that I can continue thinking about overnight and be like, wait, did I miss something? Or going over and over again
And it
and again.
was and it was really great to have Julie as our common advisor, because she
Oh my gosh.
knew she knew the story, but we were so in the weeds. So sometimes it's good to have someone who is familiar but not over familiar with every little detail, because then they can see, how is this landing? Is it making sense? Are we, there are certain things. Podcasting involves a lot storytelling, and
Mhm.
we, in our day-to-day journalism, it's much more fact-based. It's just presenting the information in as clear a way as possible. And usually there's a good story in there, but we're not leaning into it. And whereas podcasting is all about not just presenting information, but it's a way of telling it that sticks with people more. So saying, putting this information before this information, or repeating, that was the thing that we learned, I think, very quickly, is like that we could repeat information, because sometimes the listener has to hear it a couple times, or we could keep returning to a similar theme,
Right.
because every time you hit on it, it derives more power or whatever. So I think it was really great to have Julie be able to guide us along, so we didn't get stuck in the weeds and stuck in the minutia. And if we did, because sometimes people like that. I mean, especially with the true crime audience, they want to hear all the little detail and all the little evidence. So are we explaining it enough? Are people going to, grasp it?
Right.
So yeah, Julie was our North Star to find
Yeah,
that.
and I remember one time you were like, "Wait, who is this?" Like
Right.
we were like,
Right.
we brought that person up already." You're like, "That was like 4 episodes ago. I don't remember who that
Right.
is."
Right. I thought the other interesting thing, just to kind of go back to, you were asking about just kind of like the, evolution of it and the start of it. Once, as you said, we kind of took a break. So the trial happened and we took a break. And I believe it was around the end of the year, right? Because we said we're going to go out, we're going to go away for the holidays. We're all gonna just kind of
Take a beat.
decompress. Right. And then we're going to come back and decide if it makes sense to do this podcast. And, and part of that too, that I think people, people might not think about is we had to see how many people would actually be willing to participate in the podcast. Because you can't make a podcast if it's just you and Jack talking for 10 episodes and there's no other audio, right? So we had to find out, could we get any of the lawyers to talk to us? Could we get any experts to talk to us? Would anyone from the family talk to us? Would any
Hmm.
family friends talk to us? Who were going to be the players in this story if we were to do the story? And that took you guys a little bit of time, right? To kind of figure out who who were going to be the characters in our story that we could hear from. And then once we figured that out and we decided that we did have enough um, different characters, then you guys decided to put together what I forget what we called it. Maybe you guys remember, but it was that first 9 minutes of episode one. And it still gives me chills. I went back and listened to part of it in preparation for this call, and I was like, damn, it just took me back to that moment. And the way you guys wrote it, the whole idea was we're going to write what would be the first part of episode one. And then we're going to decide, we're going to we're going to share it with some other people in the organization. Because again, we had never done a podcast. Are we writing this right?
Yeah.
Does it sound, are we telling the story in an appropriate way? Again, trying not to sensationalize, but there is that element of storytelling in a podcast. And I remember listening to it, getting goosebumps and being like, I know we've never done this before, but this is damn good. And then I had to go on a call with our senior leadership team, which involved not only our boss, but all the way up to the upper levels of leadership in our company. And I remember, our CEO asking me, "Is it any good?" And and my response to her was, "It's damn good." And she goes, "Okay, let's do it." Like, and that was the conversation, like and what is amazing as everything played out then, one of our biggest fans of the podcast became our CFO.
Right.
And
Right.
I remember when he, after the podcast was over and it was the next time that they were all coming to town,
Yeah.
and he was so invested. I think they were even in town maybe while the podcast was going on. And he was asking you guys questions.
I think
What
he
about
drove
this?
by the house.
Well, right, and that was part of it too, right? So I think during the podcast, he was like he was so invested and so interested in like the story and what was going to happen, and interested in just genuinely in the people in the story, right?
Yeah.
And then yeah, when they came to town after the podcast was over, he was like, "I want to drive by the house. I need to know like where this all happened," and like he wanted to put the location, um,
Yeah.
to like, he wanted to
It's
put
like
a
seeing
location,
the faces of the people. Like you kind of just
right,
you want it to
right.
solidify in your mind. Yeah.
Yeah, which by the way, that location, just as an aside, um, obviously that house is no longer there. They eventually tore it down after years and years. They sold the property. And then eventually, a few years ago, this huge mega mansion was built on that property. They changed the address of it. So when you search for it, it's not the same address as the house. And and I remember sending pictures to both of you when I went past the house, the new house once it was built, and I was like, whoa, like this is like look at what's here now.
Hmm.
It's just it's so different. And to just I don't know, to see it now and to know what happened there and all of that is is pretty wild.
Really quickly, I want to just finally talk about how we named these episodes. Jack is very poetic. This is something about Jack. And I feel like a lot of times, Jack, we take maybe a moment or something from what someone said, but you named a lot of the episodes, and this one was called A Murder Trial is a Play. Can you talk about how we came to that?
Mm. Well,
Or do you remember?
if I'm not mistaken, that is a quote. And I'm pretty sure that was Glenn Kirshner, the former federal prosecutor. And he was talking a lot, and he um was a great interview. There's some people you interview and they just everything they say could be a quote. And you love those kind of interviews. Other people, you talk to them, it's like pulling teeth to get them to say anything interesting.
Yeah.
But he was just, quote, 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 and had a very philosophical way of, he had prosecuted many cases, and he really, the same way that, podcasting is telling a story, he was the one who really kind of expressed the idea that a trial is a story, and, in a play, and he used the, oh God, I'm going to forget. Was it Hamlet? Is that his reference?
I think so. Yeah. I think it was.
Uh, and so that we're talking about 500 years, that the idea of a trial, there's a performance, and there's
Hmm.
almost like a stage, and there's the common
Hmm.
players, and that was really kind of our experience when he said that. It totally clicked with me, because that was kind of our experience of the trial itself. You had these main characters, for lack of a better term, that you were seeing every day, and trying to follow this very complicated plot. So I think that, when you're some of the episode titles uh were just, kind of what was that episode about. But in any kind of story that you do, sometimes you really have your ears perked up when someone says something, and the way they describe it, and it's a
Hmm.
perfect quote. And that's why you get out and talk to real people and interview people, because sometimes they say things better than you ever could, and that's when you know to put quote marks around it and use it.
Well, I'm going to bring you both back later down the line to discuss a lot of things, getting the transcripts, ethical considerations that we made as journalists, how we got some of these interviews, and our takeaways from certain moments. I don't want to give anything away now for our listeners who are tuning in for the first time, so we'll have you back for later episodes. Thank you for both being here.
Absolutely.